continuing example 2D. In the second video, we're going to look at using the weighted average contribution margin per unit approach. Now this would make sense in a setting like we have here with our example, where we only have a few different units and it's not overwhelming to think about the multiple different units that you have to sell. So if you're in a setting like this, it can make sense to think about a weighted average contribution per unit. Let's go ahead and look at these requirements. Requirement 4, what percent of the total unit sales does each product represent? So what we'll do here is we'll just come up with the total unit sales. And so in each period, we're going to sell 3,250 units total. And we can just take each of these and divide by the total number of units. And we will see that we sell about 61.5% of our total units as single units, 23% of the units we sell are double, and 15% are extended. And the sum of those is going to be 100%. Okay, so that's requirement 4. Requirement 5, determine the weighted average contribution margin per unit sold. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the contribution margin per unit, which we figured out above, and we are going to weight it by the percent of sales that it represents. And this is going to allow us to compute an average contribution margin, but because we sell a lot more singles than we do doubles or extended, we're going to let that higher percentage weight our contribution margin. So we just take each contribution per unit, we multiply it by the weight or the percent of unit sales it represents. And so for each unit we have those, and then our total is going to be the sum of those. And so what this sort of says, it's a bit of a hypothetical number, but what this means is on average the units that we sell have a contribution margin of $164.62. Now, none of the individual units that we sell makes exactly that much contribution margin. So this is sort of a hypothetical unit that represents, if you sort of picked one at random, what would the expected contribution margin be, given the fact that we have a 62% chance of selling a unit that has $150 of CM, a 23% chance of selling a unit that has $180 of CM, and a 15% chance of selling a $200 CM unit. So you put those sort of expected percentages together, and it says that our weighted contribution margin on average is $164 per unit. So that's requirement 5. Requirement 6, using the company's total fixed cost and weighted average CM per unit, determine the number of total units that must be sold to break even. So we're going to take the same approach we did before. Take our fixed costs, add our target net operating income of 0 because we're trying to break even, and come up with our total targeted contribution margin. Except instead of using the overall weighted average CM ratio, we're going to use the overall weighted average CM per unit. And what we're going to say here is, on average, the units we sell give us $164 of contribution margin. So how many of those hypothetical units do we have to sell? And we can divide our $425,000 of fixed cost by $164.62, and we have to sell 2,581 units. And I'll just sort of round that up. Since in this case we're not going to sell fractional units. So we got to sell 2,582 units in order to break even. So that's the total number of units. Now this is singles, doubles, and extendeds all put together. So our next question is, how many units of each product would be sold at the break-even point? If these are our 3 products, and we know that each product represents a particular percentage of units sold, what we can do is we can take each product's number of units sold and multiply it by the total number of units being sold. And again, I'll round that up. So in order to break even exactly, we would have to sell 1,589 singles, 596 doubles, and 398 extendeds. Or, put another way, we'd have to sell 2,582 units total, and given the percentages that we normally see, that would work out to be 1,589 singles, 596 doubles, and 398 extendeds. So that's requirement 7. Requirement 8. Let's prepare a contribution format income statement at the break-even point to verify our answers above. Now, before we do this, we'll see that we have a little bit of rounding error, so we're not going to get to exactly $0 of net income, but it should help us see that the approach works and we get pretty close. So let's say sales. What's our sales revenue going to be? It's going to be 1,589 units of single times the selling price per unit of $350. Same thing with double and same thing with extended. 596 double units times $600 per double, and 398 extended units times $750 of selling price. Same thing with variable cost, 1,589 units times the variable cost per unit. And we can drag those across as well. And our CM is going to be the difference between selling price and variable cost. All right, and so we can see that our total contribution here is, if we sell 2,582 units, or 1,589 singles, 596 doubles, 398 extendeds, total contribution margin is 425,230, which again is our 425,000 plus some rounding error. Plug in our fixed costs, $425,000, and our net operating income is the difference between contribution and fixed cost, or 230, which again you'll see is about 0 with some rounding built in. And again, if we want to take a contribution margin ratio, we can see that our contribution margin ratio is about 35%. We got some rounding error built into what we've sold, but the contribution margin ratio turns out to be the same. The rounding error doesn't seem to affect that. So what we've done here in review is we looked at 2 different ways to deal with multiple unit break-even sales. We can either calculate a company-wide contribution margin ratio and treat that just like a single product contribution margin ratio. Or we can compute a company-wide weighted average contribution per unit and then treat that just like a single product contribution per unit to figure out the total number of units sold. In either of those cases, what we would need to do is figure out how many units of each product we're selling if we want to know a product by product breakdown. But we don't need to do that to come up with the company-wide totals.